Snow was still falling on the cobblestones outside a Vancouver waterfront restaurant when a 23-year-old hostess named Audra Finch threw herself in front of a bullet meant for a 78-year-old woman she had only known for 11 weeks. She survived, and by the time the ambulance had pulled away from the curb, the most dangerous man in British Columbia had already made a decision that would change both their lives forever. The Anchor and Thistle sat at the edge of Gastown like it had grown there, stubborn and old, with brass fixtures and dark wainscoting, and a kitchen that still made its own bread every morning at 5. Audra had been working the front desk for 7 months, ever since she'd moved to Vancouver from Sudbury, with $140, a rolling suitcase, and the kind of desperation that makes a person very, very good at smiling at strangers. She had rent to cover. She had a younger sister, Blythe, finishing her last year at Laurentian, tuition barely scraped together through a patchwork of loans and a part-time job at the campus bookstore. Audra sent money home when she could, which was not as often as she wanted. She smiled anyway. She always smiled. The restaurant catered to old money and older secrets. Audra had learned early not to ask questions about the men who came in on Thursday nights, the ones who arrived in pairs and spoke too quietly and always left in cash. She'd learned which tables to avoid lingering at. She'd learned that a certain kind of quiet in a room wasn't peaceful. It was careful. She'd learned all of this the way you learn to read weather, by watching long enough that you stopped needing anyone to explain it. Margaret Dunbar had started coming in every Tuesday at 6:30 in October. She always sat at table 4, the corner booth by the east window, the one that looked out over the alley and the old brick of the building next door. She ordered the same thing every week, the Pacific halibut, poached, no cream sauce, a glass of Riesling, and a small pot of Earl Grey to finish. She was 78 years old, and she moved with the kind of composure that people mistake for coldness until they sit close enough to feel the warmth underneath it. Audra had sat close enough. She'd refilled that teapot a dozen times. "You have kind eyes," Margaret had told her once, on a Tuesday in November when the rain was coming sideways off the harbor. People don't give that enough credit. Kindness in the eyes. It's rarer than people think. Audra had laughed and said something self-deprecating and gone back to the host stand, and she'd thought about that sentence for 3 days after. Margaret Dunbar was the mother of Callum Dunbar, who controlled the port of Vancouver in ways that no official document would ever confirm. He had his father's shipping empire and his mother's patience and an absolute, bone-deep ruthlessness that had made him, by age 41, the undisputed authority over a quarter of the city's underground economy. He was not the kind of man who appeared in photographs. He was not the kind of man who needed to. Audra did not know any of this. She knew Margaret liked her halibut poached and her tea strong, and that she always tipped 30%. The evening of December the 4th started like any Tuesday. Cold, clear, the harbor lights glittering off the water, the restaurant filling slowly with the usual crowd of regulars and a handful of tourists who'd wandered in from the nearby hotel. Audra was at the host stand reviewing the reservation list when Margaret arrived at 6:25, punctual as a train. She wore a gray wool coat and pearl earrings, and she nodded at Audra with the small, genuine smile she reserved for people she actually liked. "The usual table, Mrs. Dunbar?" "Please, dear." Audra walked her back, pulled out the chair, and got the tea started before the order was even placed. Small things. The kind of things you do for someone you've quietly come to look forward to seeing. She was on her way back to the kitchen with an empty bread basket when she heard the door. Not the front door, the side door, the one that opened off the laneway and was supposed to be alarmed but had been broken for 6 weeks, because the facilities manager kept forgetting to call the repair company. It swung open with a cold gust of salt air, and the man who came through it was wearing a dark canvas jacket and moving with the low, purposeful speed of someone who had done whatever he was about to do at least once before. Audra saw his hand come up. She saw where he was looking. She did not think. There was no thought. What happened in her body in that half-second had nothing to do with her mind. It was something older, something underneath thinking, and it moved her feet before she understood she was moving. She crossed the distance between herself and table 4 in 3 steps, and she put herself between the man and the 78-year-old woman sitting by the east window. The first shot went into her left shoulder. The second caught her in the side, between two ribs. The third tore through her upper arm as she twisted and fell. She hit the floor hard. The bread basket clattered away somewhere. She could hear screaming. Not her own. She wasn't making any sound. She was too focused on the strange, enormous pressure in her chest, the way the room had gone tilted and hot. She could hear Margaret's voice very close, saying her name, saying it over and over, and she could feel the pressure of old hands pressing down on her side, and the cold of the floorboards through her uniform shirt, and then everything went very dim and very far away, and she stopped being able to track any of it. She didn't hear the second gunman step out from behind the bar service station. She didn't hear the sound of a chair being used as a weapon, or the dull thud of a body going down, or the controlled, rapid footsteps of the men who poured through the front entrance 40 seconds too late. She didn't hear any of it. She didn't hear Callum Dunbar arrive. He came in through the front at 7 minutes past 7, 4 minutes after receiving the call, driving himself because his driver hadn't been fast enough. His coat was open. His face, the people in that restaurant would remember later, was the face of a man who had been operated on without anesthetic and had not yet begun to feel it. He found his mother kneeling on the floor with both hands pressed against the side of a young woman Callum had never seen before, her gray wool coat soaked through, her pearl earrings catching the low light. Margaret Dunbar was not crying. She was pressing down on the wound and she was talking to the girl in a steady, low voice. And when she heard her son's footsteps, she looked up at him with an expression he had never once seen on her face in 41 years. She stepped in front of it, Margaret said. Her voice was very calm and very precise, the way it got when she needed him to understand something completely. She had no reason to. She barely knows me. She stepped in front of it, Callum. He looked down at the girl on the floor. Young, pale, dark hair fanned out against the floorboards, breathing in shallow, rapid pulls. A hostess uniform. A name tag that said Audra. "Where are the medics?" he said, not loudly, but the two men nearest him scrambled for the door. He knelt down. He put his hand next to his mother's hand on the wound, adding pressure, not replacing her. He looked at the girl's face. Her eyes were half open, unfocused, tracking somewhere above his left shoulder. "Stay here," he said quietly. "You stay right here, you hear me?" She didn't answer. He hadn't expected her to. Vancouver General's trauma ward had seen a great many unusual things over the years, but the complete takeover of an upper-floor corridor by 18 men in good coats was by most accounts new. Callum Dunbar had arranged it with 3 phone calls. He stood by the window at the end of the hall and waited, and when the surgeon came out 5 hours later and told him that Audra Finch had lost a significant amount of blood, but that they had managed to remove all 3 bullets, and that her prognosis was cautiously good, he turned back to the window and said nothing for a very long time. Margaret found him there at 2 in the morning. She'd refused to go home. She walked with her cane, the one she only used when she was tired, and she stood beside him and looked out at the city lights reflecting off the wet street below. "You know what has to happen," she said. He knew. He'd been thinking about nothing else for 5 hours. "She's a civilian, Mum." "She was a civilian," Margaret said, with the gentle, implacable precision that had always been her particular power. "The moment Hector Reyes' people see that she survived, she becomes a problem they'll want to solve. She knows the side door. She knows the faces of at least 2 men. She knows what she saw. They will come for her in here. They will come for her the moment she goes home to whatever apartment she has in whatever part of the city she can afford. They will not stop, Callum, because leaving her alive is an embarrassment to them, and because she can describe their people. You know exactly what they'll do. I can put men on her. For how long? A year? 2? And when the men slip, when there's a shift change or a slow night or someone gets complacent, she turned to look at him. You know the only protection that actually holds. You know what the commission's rules say about touching a principal's wife. He was very still. She's 23 years old and she works at a restaurant, he said. She threw herself in front of 3 bullets for me, his mother said quietly, without hesitating, without knowing a single thing about who I was or what it would cost her. That girl has more courage in her than most of the men on your payroll. She paused. I'm not asking you to love her, Callum. I'm asking you to save her life the only way that actually works. He pressed his fingers against the cold glass of the window. Outside, a ferry was crossing the inlet, its lights steady and slow in the dark. She'll say no, he said. Then you explain to her what happens if she does, Margaret said simply. And you trust her to be as brave about this as she was about everything else. He went into the room at 3 in the morning. It was quiet except for the soft electronic pulse of the monitors. Audra Finch lay in the hospital bed, looking smaller than she had on the floor of the restaurant, which was saying something, because she hadn't looked large then either. She was awake, barely. The morphine had her at the edges of consciousness, but her eyes tracked to him when he pulled the chair close and sat down. Your mother, she said. Her voice was a dry scrape, is fine, not a scratch. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. She blinked slowly. I saw his hand go up and I don't know. I didn't think I know. A long silence, the monitor beeped steadily. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed. Am I going to be okay? She asked. Yes, he said it the ways he said all the things he meant absolutely. But I need you to listen to me carefully, because what I'm about to tell you is going to sound insane, and I need you to hear all of it before you respond. He told her the truth. All of it. He told her who his mother was, who he was, what the Reyes organization would do when they found out she'd survived and could identify their people. He watched her face change as the information settled in. Not panic, he noticed, not the hysteria some people fell into when they encountered his world for the first time. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes stayed on his. So I survived being shot, she said, and now the people who shot me want to finish the job. Yes, 'cause I can describe them. Yes. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, she said, What about my sister? Blythe. She's in Sudbury. Would they? Not if you're under my protection? And I mean fully under it. She was quiet. He could see her working through it, the same way he worked through things, not frantically but methodically, the way people do when they've had to solve their own problems for a long time without anyone helping. What does that mean? She asked carefully. Fully under it. He held her gaze. It means you marry me. The monitor beeped 4 times in the silence that followed. I'm sorry, she said. The commission's rules are absolute. The wife of a principal is untouchable. A move against her is a declaration of war against every family that sits on that commission, not just mine. The Reyes people are reckless, but they're not suicidal. If you carry my name, no one touches you. Not ever. Your sister is protected. Your debts are gone. You'll have a home, staff, security. You'll want for nothing. I don't know you, Audra said. Not accusatory, just factual. No, he agreed. You don't. I'm not asking you to. He met her eyes. I'm asking you to let me keep you alive. We can live on opposite ends of the property. This doesn't have to be anything more than a contract that keeps you breathing. But I need your answer, because I have a priest on standby and this has to happen tonight, while you're still in this building with my men on every exit. She stared at the ceiling for a long time. He waited. He was very good at waiting. Blythe finishes her degree in April, Audra said finally, very quietly. She'll finish it, and the rest of it after too, if she wants. Another silence, longer. He could see the calculation and the fear, and underneath it all, the pragmatic, clear-eyed courage that had put her on the floor of the restaurant in the first place. Okay, she said. Just that. Okay. He was already standing. The wedding took place in the room at 4:47 in the morning. Father Émile Trepanier, who had been with the Dunbar family since Callum was 12, stood at the foot of the hospital bed with a worn leather prayer book. Margaret sat in the chair by the window, upright, her hands folded in her lap, watching with an expression that was simultaneously triumphant and deeply quietly moved. 4 of Callum's most trusted men stood in the corridor outside the closed door. Audra Finch wore a hospital gown and had an IV line in her left hand. When Father Trepanier reached the rings, Callum drew a ring from his coat pocket, a square-cut diamond set in platinum, his grandmother's, from the family's private collection in the vault on Granville Street. He took Audra's uninjured hand in both of his. His hands were large and very steady, and hers was small and cold, and he slid the ring onto her finger with a care that surprised even him. I'll keep you safe, he said low, looking directly at her. Not for the priest, not for his mother. For her. I swear it. She looked up at him with dark ringed eyes and said, I'm going to hold you to that. He almost smiled. It was the closest he'd come to it in 24 hours. Father Trepanier pronounced them married. Callum pressed his lips to her forehead, brief and warm, his hand resting for a moment against the side of her face. Then he straightened up and became the man who ran the port again. He turned to his lieutenant in the doorway. I want the building swept from the top floor to the loading bay. Reyes has one man unaccounted for. Find him before morning. He didn't know yet how right his instincts were. At 5:23 in the morning, a man named Greg Veitch, no relation, just a cold coincidence of names, who had worked Callum Dunbar's internal security for 3 years, walked to the far stairwell on the 4th floor and made a call on a prepaid phone he'd purchased in Burnaby 6 weeks earlier. He kept his voice low. He told the person on the other end that the hostess had survived, that she'd married the principal, that the floor plan of the ward had 2 blind spots in the camera coverage, and that the shift change happened at 6 a.m. The voice on the other end said, Then we have 30 minutes. Don't be in the corridor when it happens. Callum Dunbar had not slept. This was not unusual. He routinely operated on 3 or 4 hours, sometimes less. What was unusual was the specific quality of alertness he'd maintained for the past 6 hours, the kind that had nothing to do with professional caution and everything to do with the particular frequency of the monitors in room 419. He was aware of this. He filed it away. At 5:40 he heard the change in the corridor. Not a sound, the absence of one. The soft, habitual shuffle of the men outside the door had gone still. In 23 years of navigating the particular dangers of his world, Callum Dunbar had learned that silence was never neutral. He was at the door in 2 steps, his Glock drawn, pressing himself flat against the wall beside the frame. He looked back at the bed. Audra's eyes were open. She'd heard it too. Don't move, he said very quietly. She nodded once. She didn't make a sound. The door handle turned. He fired twice through the upper panel of the door. A body dropped on the other side. The corridor erupted. Shouts. The crack of suppressed weapons. Holes blooming through the drywall 6 inches from the window frame. Callum crossed the room in 3 strides and used his own body to tip Audra's bed sideways, pulling her down behind the steel frame, her cry of pain muffled against his shoulder. I've got you, he said, his arm tight around her. I've got you, stay down. 2 men came through the door. He took the first one in the chest before the door finished swinging. The second hesitated, the half-second of recalibration that the first one's fall had caused, and that half-second was all it took. Callum stood from behind the overturned bed, his expression so completely empty of anything except precision that the man in the doorway seemed to understand, in his last coherent moment, that he had made a very bad decision. The third man, who came in through the adjoining room via the bathroom access, got a bullet in the knee. Callum walked over to him slowly. He crouched down and his voice was almost gentle. Who let you in? The man on the floor coughed. Gregor, he said. Your guy. Gregor let us pass the cameras. Callum stood. He looked at the man for a long moment. Then he did what needed to be done, and he went back to the bathroom, where Audra Finch was sitting in the tub in a hospital gown, with her knees drawn up and her arms wrapped around herself, shaking so hard the fixtures rattled. He knelt on the tile beside the tub. He reached out and put one hand on her arm, and she grabbed it with both of hers, and he let her. It's over, he said. It's done. Gregor, she said, her voice unsteady. Who's Gregor? Someone who worked for me. He paused. Someone who no longer does. She looked at him. Her face was exhausted and frightened and still, underneath all of it, trying to work through it clearly. That same quality he'd noticed before, that particular kind of steady she had inside the fear. How do I know, she said carefully, that there isn't another Gregor? You don't, he said. Not yet. But I'm going to spend the next 48 hours making certain there isn't. And then I'm going to move you somewhere Reyes's people can't reach you. And I'm going to dismantle every piece of his organization that still functions until there is no one left who would think of looking in your direction. She held his gaze. And my sister. I have a man in Sudbury already. She's fine. She doesn't know anything happened. Audra let out a breath that had been held, it seemed, for the better part of an hour. She leaned her head back against the porcelain. and closed her eyes. "You know," she said, after a moment, "when I moved to Vancouver, I thought the worst thing that could happen to me was not being able to cover February's rent." He made a sound that was almost a laugh, the first one in a very long time. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's get you out of here." The Dunbar estate occupied 12 acres in West Vancouver, behind a tree line of old-growth Douglas fir and a gate system that had been upgraded 3 times in the past 4 years. The main house was Georgian Revival, white stone, overlooking the inlet. It was the kind of house that had been built to impress people who didn't need to be impressed, and it had largely succeeded. Audra Finch recovered in the guest wing, which was larger than any space she had ever lived in, and tried very hard not to feel like a trespasser. She was not good at it. For the first week, she stayed in bed because the doctor insisted. The private physician Callum had installed in the East Cottage, a quiet, matter-of-fact woman named Dr. Pearson, who had the brisk efficiency of someone who had been treating inconvenient patients for 30 years, came twice a day and was deeply uninterested in the circumstances of how Audra had come to be here, which Audra found, on balance, a relief. Margaret Dunbar visited every afternoon at 3. She brought tea, always the same Earl Grey she'd ordered at the restaurant, and she sat in the chair by the window, and she talked to Audra the way she had always talked to her at table 4, frankly, warmly, with no condescension and no performance. She told Audra about her late husband's early days, building the shipping business from a single leased dock in the mid-'80s. She told her about Callum as a boy, solitary and intense, building things and taking them apart. She told her what the rules of this world were, not to frighten her, but because Margaret Dunbar believed that the most respectful thing you could do for someone was tell them the truth. "You're not a prisoner," Margaret said on the 3rd day. "I want you to understand that." "I know," Audra said. She thought she might actually mean it. Callum was almost never there. He was doing what he'd promised, systematically and methodically dismantling the infrastructure that Hector Reyes had spent 8 years building. Audra learned this not from him, but from the way the energy in the house shifted during those 3 weeks. The quiet conversations between the men who moved through the property, the calls that came at all hours, the occasional absence of several vehicles from the motor court that corresponded, she slowly worked out, with something significant happening somewhere. She saw him at breakfast twice in the first week, at dinner once. He was polite. He asked how she was feeling with the same directness he seemed to apply to everything. He did not hover or perform concern. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she preferred that to the alternative. On the 18th day she was in the library, a room she'd been cautiously claiming, a few books at a time, when he came in at 9:30 in the evening. He was still in his coat. He looked like someone had taken a very long time wearing him down, not all at once but in increments, over 18 days. He poured a glass of scotch, then looked over at her, and poured a second without asking. He set it on the side table near her chair and sat down across from her. "It's done," he said. She looked up from her book. "Reyes? What's left of his operation is scattered and leaderless, and aware of what happens if they attempt to regroup." He turned the glass in his hand. "And Gregor?" She didn't ask him to elaborate on Gregor. She'd known better than to do that for at least 2 weeks. "So I'm safe, yes." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. Outside, the winter rain was hitting the library windows in slow, irregular bursts, the kind of rain that sounds like someone thinking out loud. "What happens now?" she said. "To us, to this arrangement." He set down his glass. He looked at her the way he had looked at very few things in his life, directly, without the calculation that covered most of his attention, just a clean and unguarded looking. "I'd like it to be more than an arrangement," he said. She was very still. "You'd like," she said carefully. "Yes." He paused. "I'm aware that's an unusual thing for me to say. I'm aware that you came into this with no choice, and that matters to me, and I don't intend to." He stopped, tried again. "I'm not asking you to feel anything you don't feel, but I want you to know that for me, somewhere in the last 3 weeks, it stopped being a contract." Audra Finch, who had left Sudbury with $140 and a rolling suitcase and the kind of stubbornness that masquerades as optimism until it turns out to actually be courage, looked at the man across from her. She thought about the hand he'd held out to her in the tub, steady and offered without expectation. She thought about the way he'd said, "You stay right here on the floor of the restaurant," fierce and certain, as if her life was something he'd already decided was non-negotiable. She thought about February rent in a different city, a whole other life, and how completely she could not imagine returning to it. "It stopped being just a contract for me too," she said. "A while ago, actually." He leaned forward. He crossed the distance between the two chairs and he cupped her face in his hands. Careful, the way he was careful with very few things. And he kissed her the way a man kisses someone he almost lost before he knew he had them. Not grateful, not performed, just real and thorough and long overdue. Outside, the rain kept on. The next morning, Blythe called from Sudbury, happy and oblivious, to report that she'd passed her thesis defense and was thinking about applying to Dalhousie for a master's program. And what did Audra think? Audra sat in the library window with her Earl Grey and said, "I think that sounds perfect. I think you should do exactly that. Don't worry about the money, we'll figure it out." She looked across the room at Callum Dunbar, who was reading something at the desk in his coat, still, because he had just come in from the motor court and hadn't taken it off yet, and who glanced up at exactly that moment and raised an eyebrow. She mouthed, "Her tuition." He nodded once, already reaching for his phone. She turned back to the window. Below the tree line, the inlet was silver and flat in the morning light. Vancouver spread out beyond it, enormous and indifferent, and full of people who had no idea that the woman in the Georgian window had, 11 weeks ago, been working the host stand at a restaurant in Gastown, and that all of this, all of it, had begun with a 78-year-old woman and a breadbasket and 3 seconds of pure, unthinking instinct. She had stepped in front of the wrong bullet, or the right one. She was still deciding which. From that morning on, Audra Callahan Finch, Audra Dunbar now, though she kept Finch professionally because she'd earned the name and intended to keep using it, stopped being a person on the margins of other people's lives. She became the quiet center of one particular life, in a house above the inlet, beside a man who had learned, late and unexpectedly, that ruthlessness is not the same thing as strength, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing in a room is a 23-year-old woman with kind eyes and nothing left to lose. What would you have done in Audra's place? Said yes or walked away? And do you think Callum deserved her trust, or did she give it too soon? Let us know in the comments below. If this story stayed with you, give it a like, share it with someone who loves a good romance, and subscribe to Sadie's Romance Library, because we have more stories just like this one waiting for you.